All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be up here today. This is kind of fun because, as Billy mentioned, I previously worked for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. So 4 years ago, I got to give a talk up here, but that was before I had made the switch yet. So it's a little bit crazy that I've been here long enough now that I've got research results to share with everybody. So this is fun to get to do. This is going to be research that was done by one of my graduate students. Audrey Tolley is listed first on the names here because most of this comes from her work, but this is a long-term project that spans back before her. So I'll have some additional acknowledgments at the end of this presentation to cover. And then Dr. Gonzalez was co-chair with me on Audrey's committee, and Dr. French was on her committee as well. So if we're going to be talking about restoring grassland birds, let's first talk about what grassland birds are. And I'm going to break this down into two different communities of what we consider to be grassland birds. First of all, we have grassland obligate species, which are grassland birds that require really just pristine grasslands. Usually they do best if you have less than 1% brush on the landscape, which is virtually no brush at all. All of these are experiencing population decline. Some of the highest population declines, we're talking about around 3 to 4% population decline every year. And so a lot of these have lost substantial numbers over the last 30 to 40 years. The other community that we'll talk about uses grasslands, but we refer to these as grassland facultative because they can use a wider range of brush densities. They're fine if there isn't as much brush, but they kind of prefer a little bit intermediate levels, maybe 10 to 20. And it varies depending on the species as to what that kind of ideal percentage of brush looks like. But these guys overall are a little bit more flexible to move across those different brush densities. And so consequently, we do have some of them, the populations are of concern, but overall, these are not experiencing the same decline that our grassland obligate species are. Now, there's a bunch of different species in these. So on the left, we have a Baird sparrow, and on the right is a black-throated sparrow. But within each of these communities, there's a lot of different species. They look a lot alike. You can tell our black-throated sparrow is kind of nice. He's got this nice little tuxedo on, so he's a little easier to tell apart. The rest of them just look like little brown birds. So if I keep showing pictures of little brown birds, there's maybe some different species in here, but they look a lot alike, especially in the winter when we're studying them. But they are different species with different habitat requirements. So next, let's talk about these unencroached grasslands that these grassland obligate species really prefer. This is a picture from the Dixon Water Foundation's MIMS unit. Some of y'all may be going on a field trip there tomorrow. Hopefully it looks this happy, especially with the rain that we're getting. Hopefully they're also getting rain right now. That doesn't always happen that everybody gets it. But you can see in this picture we have grass and mountains and sky and some cattle and no brush at all. So this is what we're talking about that those grassland obligate species really need. This is a different part of the MIMS. This was taken during some of our winter field work, and so you can tell it looks colder. I don't know. Can you tell? It looks colder to me. Maybe because I took the picture, so it seemed colder at the time. But also it's during the winter, right? So all of the grasses are dormant as opposed to the lovely green in the previous picture. Now in this picture, you can see more brush, right? So this is more than most of our grassland obligate species would want. But the point of showing both of these pictures is to understand that across our grasslands, we used to have less brush encroachment, but there's always been some variability, right? There's places that are going to favor more brush, and that's not a bad thing because Dr. Luna would not be happy if we took away all the brush because scaled quail like brush, and so anybody who hunts scaled quail or manages for scaled quail, and some of our other species know that a little bit of brush is good. But in that first picture, that's good for our grassland obligates, that's good for pronghorn, that's good for cattle. Now, this is a really stylized picture, but this is kind of to dive into why we've seen these declines in our grassland obligate birds. So this shows the warm colors here are the breeding areas for our grassland obligate species across the U.S. and really North America. And then these cool colors are the wintering areas. And what I like about this graphic is that it shows here this little black squiggly outline is the Chihuahuan Desert. And right pretty much where we're sitting right now is where they've put the X as kind of the heart of where this wintering grounds is. So nearly 90% of our grassland obligate birds that live in North America are spending the winter here in the Chihuahuan Desert. So our grasslands are vital for a large number of these species. But those grasslands are changing, right? And there's various changes to these landscapes that are impacting our birds. But one of the really big ones is woody plant encroachment. Why do woody plants encroach on what was previously a grassland? There's a few different reasons, but the bottom line is that habitat has changed to become more suitable for the brush to grow than the grass. Here in West Texas, fire return intervals are not well understood, but then they were probably quite long, right? But in other parts of the state, as you head out east, there's places that were supposed to burn every year, right? Especially or throughout the central part of the state, maybe every 5 years, 5 to 10 years. But believe it or not, baby mesquite do get killed by fire, right? If they're a little mesquite, a fire can kill them. Once you get into these, bigger brush, then you're not going to be able to kill that with a fire. So if fire is suppressed for some period of time, that brush can get a foothold and get big enough to where fire isn't going to kill it. Now, in this picture, this is south of town. Dr. Avila took this picture, and this is juniper, which is another very common encroaching species, not just here, but as you head north through the Great Plains. Juniper is the problem a lot of times. Of course, in Texas, mesquite is a big problem, as I've mentioned. And then out here where it's dry, and as you move farther into the west, creosote and tarbush can also be some of the encroaching species. Another cause of this can be overgrazing because cattle eat the grass and they're not eating the brush, right? So if there's too much grass removed from the landscape, that can be a foothold for the brush. And then drought can be another reason. Grass, can get really long, wonderful root systems, but brush can sometimes go even deeper and can hold on to that water a little bit longer. And of course, we almost never see one of these things happening by itself, right? So a lot of times these factors are combining. And again, we can get brush encroachment to the point where we can move past a brush encroached grassland to a shrubland, right? And so it's kind of this new stable state where it's much harder to remove that brush, and running a fire through it. Again, if you run a fire through mature mesquite, those are going to be able to come back. So it's not really staying as a grassland anymore. Now, impacts that this encroachment has on our grassland obligate bird species, there's kind of 3 main impacts. One is reducing food. So our birds that are here in the winter are really reliant on grass seeds. So if you have less grass, you have less grass seeds to be able to eat. They also, probably even more importantly than that, are using those grasses for shelter. So it does get quite cold here in the winter, and being able to get down into those grasses as opposed to in a shrub that's a little bit more exposed, that's just not really their habit, or the bare ground certainly gets much colder. In the same way that in the winter, ground nesting species will use a bunch of grass as opposed to bare ground. The bare ground is much hotter. So it's always better to be in that little clump of grass. And exposure is actually a major cause of mortality for a lot of these grassland birds in the winter if they don't have sufficient cover to get into to keep warm overnight. The third impact is that these brush structures favor predators. So I've been talking about songbirds, but most people are probably familiar with this one. This guy's about the size and shape of a songbird, but he is in fact a stone cold killer. This is a loggerhead shrike. And they will eat other songbirds. They have a special hook at the back of their beak that they use to pierce the vertebrae of a bird that they catch. And if you ever see them stuck onto things, they'll stick them onto cactus thorns or barbed wire or whatever, and they can save them for later, or they can eat them immediately, which we think may be what they're doing with some of the sparrows. But this guy, because he's sparrow-sized, he does not need a tree to perch in. He doesn't really even need what a lot of us would consider to be a very substantial shrub, right? He just needs a little bit of something to perch on. And if it's tall enough, that gives him a better vantage point from which he can hunt. And so that can increase the impact on our grassland birds. Interestingly, in another study that we were doing where we were looking at different species of birds that were using dirt livestock tanks, we expected that we would have more shrikes when we had more brush, right? More perches, more places. But what we found was actually they were kind of across any amount of brush. So even just one shrub on a tank increased the likelihood that we would have these guys. So it really does make a difference for those birds and the risk they experience. Now, other avian predators, raptors, are something else that will take out those grassland obligate birds. And even our biggest raptors are not more than just a couple pounds. So it really doesn't need to be a huge shrub for it to support predators using it. So this research was done across mostly in the Marfa and Marathon grasslands. And so I'm going to talk about these different properties where we surveyed. First, as I've mentioned, the MIMS unit, again, where some of y'all will be out tomorrow, we used that as our reference grassland. So because it's fairly unencroached, we used that as kind of our comparison site. Then we used an anonymous ranch that was west of Marfa that was sprayed. About 4,000 acres was sprayed with herbicide in 2019. Another 500 was sprayed in 2021. And in 2023, they used a roller chopper to come through and knock down that brush. Then there was another ranch outside of Marfa that we added to our study. It had just 4 study units, but that was to compare some of the differences that we saw in precipitation. And then finally, a ranch out near Marathon that was treated just 1,000 acres of herbicide. Now, the point of this study was we wanted to look at removing this brush, but our hypothesis was that it would restore to a grasslands faster if we combined that mechanical and that herbicide treatment, especially because if you're a grassland bird that's here in the winter, a dead shrub and a dormant shrub with no leaves look the same, right? So we hypothesized that that may not actually be making a difference, and that mechanical treatment is what was needed to get those shrubs actually off the landscape and get us to restoration faster. So there were survey grids set up across all of these properties. This was done in partnership with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and scaled to the size of the ranch. So MIMS has 10 of these 1 kilometer square survey units. The other Marfa Ranch had 30, and then Marathon Ranch had 20. Each of these were laid out so that there's 3 transects. We did these as walking transects and not point counts, which is done for some other bird surveys, because again, it's winter, it's cold, and those birds are hiding down tight in that grass. So if you just stand and listen, you're going to miss virtually everything that's there. So we were walking through the grass, often flushing these species and then counting them and determining what species they were. So we would walk starting on either the northernmost or the southernmost, going from east to west, come back west to east on Transect 2, and then go the other way. And there were vegetation surveys associated with this as well. I'm just not talking about those today. All right, so jumping into the results here. Again, these 4 different areas, grassland refers to the units that were done on MIMS, and actually that other Marfa Ranch that was added in to compare precipitation. There was some good grassy areas of there that we wanted to compare. And you can see that it varies a lot in different years, right? These populations naturally fluctuate a lot. The maroon color is our grassland obligate species, and the kind of golden color is facultative and other species. In our combination treatment, where it was sprayed with herbicide and then knocked down mechanically, you can see that in any given year, we have a higher proportion of facultative birds than we saw in our reference grasslands. But remember, our mechanical treatment was here in 2023, and in 2024 and 2025, you can see a higher percentage of our grassland obligate birds. You also saw that in 2022 before we knocked that down. So I don't entirely know what caused that. Here's our herbicide-only treatment, though, and you can see how much bigger that proportion is of those facultative species. And same thing in our untreated areas. Those are a lot more similar. The other thing that I want you to notice here is that these y-axes are not scaled the same. So whereas 2020 we saw 7,000 different birds on those reference grasslands, the most we ever saw on our combination treatment was closer to 2,000, maybe 250. And on the herbicide only on the untreated areas, we never counted more than 1,000 birds. This is a certain way of looking at these results in relation to all the different variables that we measured. So a lot of bird species were measured and a lot of factors went into this. So this was done on a multivariate analysis. But essentially what you're seeing here is that the green indicates grassland sites. And when you have more of those, this is in relation to basically a brush gradient. So this is a chestnut-collared longspur. They're grassland obligate. And we saw a lot higher counts of those when we had less brush. On our black-throated sparrow, we saw high counts throughout kind of all of this. You can see those other colors here as well. We're moving towards more brush, and we see a variety of black-throated sparrow counts across those different brush densities. Looking at these a different way, this is kind of similar to the previous, but what we're pulling in here is year. So we have these different groups. The blue and the purple are the herbicide and the untreated, and you can see how closely those circles overlap. Our green, again, is our reference, and our pink is our combo. They're not super similar, but what's interesting here is that the darker shaded circles refer to the more recent years, to 2024 and 2025. All of those fall over here closer to that grassland. This is my favorite way to present these data. Think of 0 as the grassland, and then these other 3 are indicating our treatments. Over time, the combination treatment, the line trend is down towards the grassland reference, whereas these other 2 are both going up and in fact paralleling each other. What that means is that not only is our herbicide not taking us back towards the grassland, it's going the other way. It's moving in the same direction as those untreated shrublands. So our takeaway is that it needs that chemical and mechanical treatment to be able to restore grassland from a grassland obligate bird perspective. Now, this was done over 7 years worth of data. Those shrubs are still standing, those dead shrubs. 5 years from now, will they fall down? 10 years from now, will they fall down? We keep hoping they'll fall down really soon on the places that haven't been mechanically treated. But it takes a long time out here to get restoration done. You can have a year where you don't have good rain and you're just not going to get that grass recovery. So being able to knock those down mechanically makes a big difference. I mentioned that this has been a long-term project. So Dr. Chavez Trevino, it was actually the first graduate student on this project. He's now back with us as a visiting assistant professor for BRI. Emily Card was the second student, and then Dr. Titular and Dr. Harvison also helped in the early stages of this project. And all of us are working together to get this out and published soon. So we'll have these submitted soon. One publication will focus on this, and the other is focused on those target species and how specifically they respond to different, a little bit narrower, finer-tuned classification of those shrub densities. So I think, I'm not sure if I have time for questions, but if I do, I'll take those now.
Do you have any idea how big a space is required to be effective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have seen some predictions that say, on a landscape, just being able to remove one shrub or tree can open up, acres of habitat, right? If it's kind of in the middle there. What the amount as far as like how much brush around that needs to be treated to really make a difference, I don't know. That's not something that we've looked at, but it's a really good question. I do know that if you have some area that is unencroached, you can make a big difference by just expanding next to that, right? Because these birds do need fairly sizable areas. So rather than saying, okay, well, here's my grasslands, here's some shrubs, and I'll clear over here, it's better to expand that existing grasslands and clear that area that's adjacent to it because you impact more of that existing grasslands, if that makes sense. Near mountains versus further away from mountains, I don't know, because across these sites we were trying to keep it fairly similar. One of our properties does go up towards the mountains, but we were trying to compare apples to apples, and so I don't know about the effect as you're adjacent to mountains. That's a good question.
I was just wondering, have y'all done, or are y'all going to do any studies on ranches that do regenerative practices rather than chemical or mechanical? Have y'all looked into doing any studies on that?
That's a great question. So the MIMS unit does have rotational grazing. So those surveys were across rotational and continuously grazed places. The hard thing out here is that our brush can't really be taken out effectively without using some sort of herbicide initially. After that, it can be maintained through grazing. But we can't get enough grazing pressure in those areas to be able to remove some of those species. And so herbicide, as much as, a lot of people like to avoid using chemicals, it's our best way to get rid of that so that we can start over and get there a little bit quicker.